I stood in the corner of the conservatory, my back against the cold glass wall that overlooked the Atlantic. The chair they'd given me wasn't really at the table. It was positioned just far enough away that I could see everyone, but they didn't have to acknowledge I was there. The late afternoon sun cut through the windows in sharp angles, illuminating the dust particles that danced between me and the rest of the Frost family. Nobody had spoken to me since I arrived. Not a hello, not even a polite nod. Just silence, the kind that feels intentional, the kind that's been practiced for years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My mother, Judith Frost, sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her posture so rigid it looked painful. She wore a black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, pearls at her throat, her silver hair swept back in a style that hadn't changed since I was a child. To her right sat my father, Richard, staring down at his folded hands like they held answers he couldn't find anywhere else. My brother Brandon lounged in his chair with the kind of casual arrogance that comes from never being told no, his expensive watch catching the light every time he moved. And then there was Cassandra, my sister, who sat with her legs crossed and her phone face down on the table, her expression carefully neutral, as if she were attending a board meeting and not the reading of our grandfather's will. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, a simple navy blue thing I'd bought at a thrift store in Portland. It felt wrong here, too plain, too honest. I'd thought about wearing something else, something that might help me blend in, but then I remembered I'd stopped trying to blend in with them a long time ago. The lawyer, Daniel Mitchell, sat across from my mother, a leather portfolio open in front of him. He was younger than I expected, maybe in his early 40s, with kind eyes and the sort of calm demeanor that probably came from years of delivering news people didn't want to hear. He cleared his throat, and the room fell into an even deeper silence. Then I heard it. My mother leaned slightly toward Cassandra and whispered, just loud enough for the sound to carry across the conservatory, "I still don't understand why she even bothered to come. It's not like William left her anything. She's not really part of this family anymore." The words landed like stones in still water. Cassandra didn't respond, but she didn't need to. The sentiment hung there, visible and ugly. Daniel's eyes flicked toward me for just a moment, and I saw something there, recognition maybe, or perhaps pity. I didn't want either. I kept my face blank and my hands still in my lap, even though my heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. Daniel adjusted his glasses and began, "We are gathered here today to execute the last will and testament of William Frederick Frost, who passed on March 19th of this year. As many of you know, William was very particular about his wishes, and he made several revisions to this document in the months leading up to his death." He paused, glancing around the table. "Some of those revisions may come as a surprise." Brandon shifted in his seat. Cassandra picked up her phone, then set it back down. Judith's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened around the stem of her untouched water glass. Daniel continued, reading through the preliminary items with the kind of measured tone that made everything sound both important and routine. "To my son Richard Frost, I leave my collection of maritime maps and the sailboat Northwind, along with the slip fees paid in perpetuity at the Newport Yacht Club." My father nodded once, a small movement that barely registered. "To my grandson, Brandon Frost, I leave the summer house in Cape Cod, fully furnished, along with the attached trust fund established in 1998, currently valued at $1.2 million. Brandon smiled, the kind of smile that said he'd expected exactly this. Cassandra was next. "To my granddaughter, Cassandra Frost, I leave my investment portfolio with Morgan Stanley, currently valued at approximately $2.4 million, as well as the art collection housed at the Boston residence." She exhaled, a sound of satisfaction barely concealed. Judith received the jewelry, an emerald set that had belonged to my grandmother, and several parcels of land in Vermont. Each bequest was met with nods, small smiles, the quiet acknowledgement of expectations fulfilled. I sat there, waiting for my name to be skipped over entirely. It wouldn't have surprised me. In fact, part of me had prepared for it, had told myself on the long drive down from Portland that I was only here out of respect for my grandfather, not because I expected anything from him or from them. But then Daniel paused. He flipped a page in the portfolio, and his expression shifted just slightly, a tightening around his eyes that suggested what came next was significant. And finally, he said, his voice taking on a different weight, regarding the controlling interest in Frost Maritime Holdings, the primary estate known as Frost Manor here in Newport, and the consolidated financial assets held in trust, with a combined valuation of $47 million. The room went completely still. I could hear the ocean outside, the distant cry of gulls, the faint creak of the old house settling. These assets in their entirety are hereby bequeathed to my granddaughter Elena Margaret Frost. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Judith's water glass slipped from her hand. It didn't shatter because it hit the carpet, but the sound of it hitting the floor was loud enough to break the spell. Brandon stood up so fast his chair scraped backward with a harsh screech. Cassandra's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. My father finally looked up, his face pale, his eyes wide and confused as if he'd just woken from a dream and didn't recognize where he was. And I just sat there, frozen, my mind trying to catch up with the words I'd just heard. $47 million. Frost Maritime Holdings. The manor, all of it. To me, this has to be a mistake, Brandon said, his voice sharp and loud in the quiet room. There's no way. He wouldn't. She doesn't even work in the business, she doesn't know anything about it. Daniel looked at him calmly. There is no mistake, William was very clear about his intentions. This will was reviewed and notarized by 3 separate witnesses, and he was of sound mind when he made these revisions. Judith stood now, her face flushed, her carefully maintained composure cracking at the edges. This is absurd. Elena hasn't been part of this family in years. She left. She chose to leave. You can't just hand over everything we've built to someone who walked away. I didn't build it, I said quietly, and everyone turned to look at me. It was the first time I'd spoken since arriving. Grandfather built it, and apparently, he decided what to do with it. Cassandra laughed, a bitter sound. Oh, so now you have opinions. Now you want to be involved? I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. My hands were shaking, so I pressed them flat against my thighs. Daniel cleared his throat again. There's more. William left specific instructions that a video message be played at this time. He wanted to address the family directly. He reached into his bag and pulled out a tablet, setting it on the table and angling it so everyone could see. The screen flickered to life, and there he was. My grandfather, William Frost, sitting in the...
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Library of this very house, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the cliffs and the sea beyond. He looked older than I remembered, more frail, but his eyes were sharp, and when he spoke his voice was steady and strong. If you're watching this, he began. Then I'm gone. And you've just heard something you didn't expect. Good. I intended it that way. He leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in his lap. I've spent the last 15 years watching this family very closely. Not the business meetings or the quarterly reports, though I've seen those too. I've been watching the choices you make when you think no one's paying attention. The small cruelties. The casual dismissals. The way you treat people who can't do anything for you. Judith's face had gone very pale. Brandon looked like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Cassandra stared at the screen, unblinking. Richard, my grandfather continued, looking directly into the camera, as if he could see through time. You've spent 30 years letting Judith make every decision, even the ones you knew were wrong. You stood by when Elena needed you, and you said nothing. That's not strength. That's cowardice." My father flinched like he'd been slapped. "Brandon, you've built a career on other people's work. The patent lawsuit you settled last year? I know about that. I know you stole that design from an intern and buried him in legal fees when he tried to fight back. That's not business. That's theft." Brandon's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists on the table. "Cassandra, you fired a woman from the charitable foundation because she asked questions about where the donations were actually going. You blacklisted her in every organization in Boston. She lost her career because she did the right thing, and you couldn't stand being questioned." Cassandra's face had gone red, her eyes bright with something that might have been anger or shame or both. Then my grandfather's expression softened, and he looked somewhere off camera, as if he were searching for someone just out of frame. "And Elena," he said, and my breath caught in my throat, "you're the only one who never asked me for anything. Not money, not favors, not a place at the table. You built a life on your own terms, and when they mocked you for it, you kept going. That's not weakness. That's integrity." Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and fast, and I didn't bother to wipe them away. "I'm leaving you everything because you're the only one who understands that wealth isn't about what you own. It's about what you do with it. The rest of them see money as power, you see it as responsibility. And that, my dear girl, is why you're the only one I trust to carry this forward." The screen went dark. The conservatory was silent, except for the sound of the ocean and my own ragged breathing. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. And I realized, sitting there in that corner they'd given me, that I'd just been handed not a gift, but a test. My grandfather hadn't just given me his fortune. He'd given me a choice. I could walk away, let them fight over the scraps, go back to my quiet life in Portland and pretend none of this ever happened. Or I could stay. I could fight. I could prove that he was right to believe in me. The memory hit me suddenly, without warning, the way they always do. I was 14, standing in the kitchen of the Cape Cod house, the summer house that Brandon now owned. It was the 4th of July, and the whole family was there for the annual party. There were fireworks planned, a catered dinner, guests arriving in expensive cars that crunched over the gravel driveway. I'd spent the morning helping the staff set up tables on the lawn, arranging flowers in vases, folding napkins into shapes I'd learned from a YouTube video. I wanted to be useful. I wanted them to see me. Cassandra had just gotten her acceptance letter to Yale. It had arrived that morning, and Judith had spent the entire day calling relatives, making sure everyone knew. There was going to be a toast at dinner, a special announcement, a cake with Cassandra's name written in blue and white icing. I was happy for her, genuinely. She'd worked hard, and Yale was a big deal. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I couldn't help remembering that I'd won a regional art competition the month before. My painting, a watercolor of the lighthouse at Portland Head, had taken first place out of 200 entries. The prize was a scholarship to a summer arts program, full tuition, room and board included. I'd told Judith about it the day I found out, bursting into her office with the acceptance email pulled up on my phone. She'd glanced at it, nodded once, and said, "That's nice, Elena. Make sure you thank them promptly." Then she'd gone back to her computer, and I'd stood there for a moment, waiting for something more, some acknowledgement that this mattered. But nothing came, so I'd left. At dinner that night, Judith stood and raised her glass. "I want to make a toast," she announced, her voice carrying across the lawn, where 50 people sat at white-clothed tables. "To Cassandra, who has made us all so proud. Yale is lucky to have you, darling." Everyone clapped. Cassandra smiled, gracious and perfect. I clapped too, my hands feeling mechanical. Then my grandfather, who was sitting beside me, leaned over and whispered, "What about your scholarship, Elena?" I shrugged. "It's not the same thing." He frowned. "Why not?" I didn't have an answer, at least not one I wanted to say out loud. But later that night, After the fireworks and the guests had gone home, I found an envelope on my bed. Inside was a note in my grandfather's handwriting. First place out of 200 is not nothing. Don't let them make you believe it is. Beneath the note was a check for $500 and a brochure for an art supply store in Portland. At the bottom of the brochure, he'd written, "Get the good brushes. You've earned them." I'd cried that night, not because of the money, but because someone had seen me, really seen me. Not as an afterthought or an obligation, but as a person who had done something worth celebrating. It was the first time I realized that my grandfather was paying attention in ways the rest of them weren't. Over the years, there were other moments like that. Small things, quiet gestures that nobody else noticed. When I graduated from college, Judith and Richard didn't come to the ceremony. They said they had a conflict, some business dinner they couldn't reschedule. Brandon and Cassandra didn't come either. But my grandfather did. He sat in the audience by himself, clapped when my name was called, and took me to dinner afterward at a small seafood place near campus. We didn't talk about the fact that no one else had shown up. We didn't need to. When I moved to Portland, away from Newport and away from them, Judith called it running away. "You're just going to give up," she'd said over the phone, her voice tight with disapproval. "You're going to throw away every opportunity you've been given, and go work at some community center in Maine." I'd tried to explain that it wasn't giving up, that I wanted to do something meaningful, something that felt like mine. But she didn't understand, and eventually I stopped trying to make her. My grandfather, though, he understood. He visited me once, unannounced, about a year after I'd moved. I came home from work to find him sitting on the steps of my apartment building, a paper bag beside him. "I brought sandwiches," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. We ate on my tiny balcony that overlooked the harbor, and he asked me about my work, about the people I was helping, about whether I was happy, and when I said yes, I was. He nodded and said, "Good, that's all that matters." I didn't know then that he was watching the rest of them too, cataloging their failures, their cruelties, the way they moved through the world, taking and taking without ever giving back. I didn't know he was making plans, changing his will, deciding who deserved what he'd built. I just knew that he saw me, and that was enough. The conservatory felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the air itself had thickened. Judith was the first to break the silence. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "We'll contest it. There are ways. If he wasn't of sound mind, if he was coerced, if there's any evidence of undue influence." Daniel shook his head. "Mrs. Frost, I can assure you that William was thoroughly evaluated by 3 separate physicians in the months before his death. All of them certified that he was mentally competent. Additionally, he met with 2 other law firms to review this will and ensure it would withstand any legal challenge. You're welcome to try, but I don't believe you'll succeed." Brandon slammed his hand on the table. "So that's it. She gets everything, and we just have to accept it." Daniel looked at him calmly. "You've each received substantial bequests. Many people would consider themselves fortunate." "Fortunate," Cassandra's voice was sharp. "She gets the company, the house, everything that actually matters, and we get table scraps. You got millions of dollars," I said quietly, and again they all turned to look at me. "You got more money than most people will see in their entire lives, and you're calling it scraps, because it's not everything." Judith's eyes narrowed. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You don't know the first thing about running a business, about managing assets, about any of this. You'll destroy everything William built within a year." "Maybe," I said, my voice steadier now, "or maybe I'll do things differently. Maybe that's what he wanted." Richard finally spoke, his voice quiet and strained. "Elena, you have to understand, this is complicated. The company has investors, employees, responsibilities. You can't just walk in and take over without experience." "I'm not planning to walk in and take over," I said. "I'm planning to learn. And if grandfather thought I could do this, then maybe I owe it to him to try." The silence stretched out again, and then Judith stood, smoothing her dress with sharp, angry movements. "We're leaving," she said to Richard. "Daniel, you'll be hearing from our attorneys." She walked out without looking at me, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Richard followed, his shoulders slumped. Brandon and Cassandra lingered for a moment, both of them staring at me like I was a stranger who'd wandered into their house uninvited. "You know," Brandon said finally, "you could make this easy on everyone. You could step aside, let people who actually know what they're doing handle it. We'd compensate you fairly." I met his eyes. "I'm sure you would, but I don't think I'm interested in easy." He shook his head, disgusted, and left. Cassandra was the last to go. She paused at the door, turned back. "He loved you more," she said, and there was something raw in her voice, something that sounded almost like pain. "We did everything right, everything he asked, and it was never enough. But you left, you ignored us, and somehow that made you his favorite. How is that fair?" I didn't have an answer for her. Maybe there wasn't one. She left, and then it was just me and Daniel in the conservatory, the late afternoon sun turning everything gold. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. I laughed, a shaky sound. "I have no idea." He smiled. "That's fair. For what it's worth, I think William knew exactly what he was doing. He talked about you a lot in our meetings. He was very proud of you." "I don't know if I can do this," I admitted. "I don't know anything about maritime shipping or business management, or any of it." Daniel closed his portfolio. "You don't have to know everything right now. You have time to learn, and there are people who can help you. William set up a transition team, advisors he trusted. They're expecting to hear from you." He handed me a business card. "This is my direct line. Call me if you need anything, anytime." I took the card, my hands still shaking. "Thank you." After he left, I sat alone in the conservatory for a long time, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, the sky turning from gold to pink, to deep purple. The house felt enormous around me, full of rooms I barely remembered, and ghosts I wasn't sure I wanted to face. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the ocean, that constant rhythm that never stopped, never changed. I thought about my apartment in Portland, my small life, my quiet routines. I thought about the people I worked with, the community center kids, who brought me drawings, the elderly woman who came to my art therapy sessions every Thursday, and painted seascapes from memory. I thought about everything I'd built away from this place, away from them, and then I thought about my grandfather, sitting in that library, making this choice. Trusting me with everything he'd spent his life creating. I pulled out my phone, and looked at the last text he'd sent me, 3 weeks before he died, just 4 words. "Be brave, Elena. Always." I didn't know what being brave looked like yet. I didn't know if I could stand up to my family, navigate the business world, live up to the faith he'd placed in me, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to run, not this time. I stood up, smoothed my simple navy dress, and walked out of the conservatory, into the vast quiet halls of Frost Manor. Somewhere in this house was the library where he'd recorded that video. Somewhere in this house were answers, plans, pieces of the puzzle he'd left for me to assemble. I was going to find them, and then I was going to figure out what it meant to be a Frost. Not their version, mine. I spent that first night in one of the guest rooms on the 2nd floor. I couldn't bring myself to sleep in what had been my grandfather's room, and my old childhood bedroom felt like stepping into a museum exhibit of a person I no longer was. The guest room was neutral, impersonal, with cream-colored walls and furniture that looked expensive but unlived in. I lay awake until nearly 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle and creak around me. Every sound felt amplified in the darkness, each groan of old wood or rattle of window glass, a reminder that this place was mine now, whether I knew what to do with it or not. My phone buzzed just after midnight, a text from Cassandra. "We need to talk, just you and me." I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to respond, wanted to believe that maybe she was reaching out in good faith, that maybe somewhere beneath all the anger and resentment there was still a sister who remembered building sandcastles with me on the beach when we were small. But I'd learned a long time ago that hope could be a dangerous thing in this family. I turned my phone face down on the nightstand and tried to sleep. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the gauzy curtains and the sound of someone moving around downstairs. For a disoriented moment, I forgot where I was, forgot everything that had happened. Then it all came rushing back: the will reading, the video, the way my mother's face had looked when she realized I'd inherited everything she thought belonged to them. I got dressed in the same clothes I'd worn the day before, jeans and a sweater that felt too casual for a house like this, and went downstairs to investigate the noise. I found Helen in the kitchen, a woman in her late 50s with gray-streaked hair, pulled back in a practical bun. She'd been working at Frost Manor for as long as I could remember, one of those people who moved through the background of family gatherings, always present but rarely acknowledged. She looked up when I walked in, her expression cautious but not unfriendly. "Miss Elena," she said, and there was something careful in her voice, as if she wasn't sure what to call me now. "I wasn't sure if you'd still be here this morning. I made coffee. There are pastries from the bakery in town if you're hungry." "Thank you," I said, pouring myself a cup from the French press on the counter. The coffee was strong and good, and I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, grateful for something to hold on to. "Helen, can I ask you something?" she nodded, wiping down the already spotless countertop. "Of course." I hesitated, not sure how to phrase the question. "Did my grandfather ever talk to you about his plans? About what he was going to do with the estate?" She paused in her cleaning, her eyes meeting mine. "Mr. Frost talked to all of us, the staff I mean. He wanted to make sure we understood that our positions would be secure no matter what happened. He said you'd take care of us, that you weren't like the others." The weight of that statement settled over me. It wasn't just the business or the house I'd inherited, it was people, lives, responsibilities that extended beyond balance sheets and property deeds. "He had a lot of faith in you," Helen continued quietly. "More than I think he had in anyone else. He used to say that you were the only one who understood what mattered." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and sipped my coffee. Helen went back to her work, and I wandered through the first floor of the manor, reacquainting myself with rooms I hadn't set foot in for years. The formal dining room with its crystal chandelier and table that could seat 20. The sitting room with its antique furniture and paintings of stern-faced Frost ancestors. The library, the one from the video, with those floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the cliffs. I stood in the library for a long time, running my fingers along the spines of leather-bound books, most of which looked like they'd never been opened. This was where he'd sat when he recorded that message, where he'd looked into the camera and told my family exactly what he thought of them. I tried to imagine what that must have felt like, knowing he was dying, knowing he was about to upend everything they'd taken for granted. There was a desk in the corner, a massive thing made of dark wood, with carved legs and brass handles on the drawers. I sat down in the chair behind it, the leather creaking under my weight, and opened the top drawer. Inside were files, dozens of them, each labeled in my grandfather's precise handwriting. Business reports, financial statements, legal documents, and underneath all of that, a manila envelope with my name on it. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a letter, several pages long, written in the same careful script. "Dear Elena," it began, "if you're reading this, then the will has been read, and you know what I've done. I imagine you're confused, possibly angry, certainly overwhelmed. I don't blame you. What I'm asking of you is neither fair nor easy, but I believe you're the only one who can do it." I read on, my eyes burning. He explained his reasoning, not just the moral failures he'd outlined in the video, but the business decisions he'd watched the rest of the family make over the years. The shortcuts, the ethical compromises, the way they'd gradually eroded the values the company had been built on. Frost Maritime was founded on the principle that a handshake meant something, he wrote, that our word was worth more than any contract. Your father and brother have forgotten that. They see every deal as a transaction to be won, every relationship as leverage to be exploited. They've made us rich,
but they've also made us hollow. He went on to describe a specific incident from 2 years ago, something I'd known nothing about. Brandon had secured a major shipping contract with a manufacturing company, underbidding 3 competitors by a significant margin. What the family didn't advertise was that he'd achieved those numbers by cutting costs in ways that violated maritime safety regulations. The crew quarters on those ships were substandard, the maintenance schedules inadequate. When a union representative raised concerns, Brandon had threatened to relocate the entire operation overseas, effectively killing the complaint before it could gain traction. No one died, my grandfather wrote. We were lucky, but luck isn't a business strategy, and silence isn't the same as consent. I tried to talk to Brandon about it, tried to make him understand why this was unacceptable. He told me I was being sentimental, that this was how business worked.
Now, that's when I knew I couldn't leave this in his hands. The letter continued, outlining other incidents. Cassandra's manipulation of the charitable foundation's accounting to make the family look more philanthropic than they actually were. Richard's passive endorsement of policies he privately disagreed with, because confronting Judith was easier than standing on principle. And Judith herself, who had spent years cultivating an image of the family as pillars of the Newport community, while systematically excluding anyone who didn't meet her standards of worthiness, including me. You left because you couldn't stomach what we were becoming, he wrote. I respect that. But now I'm asking you to come back, not to join them, but to change them. Or if they can't be changed, to build something different in their place. The letter ended with practical instructions. Names of advisors I could trust, lawyers who'd helped him structure the will to be legally bulletproof, financial managers who understood the company's operations inside and out. You don't have to do this alone, he wrote. I've made sure of that. But you do have to decide if you're willing to do it at all. If you're not, if this is too much, I'll understand. There are provisions in the will for that scenario. You can walk away with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life, and the company will be sold to a third party I've already vetted, but I hope you'll stay. I hope you'll fight, because if anyone can turn this around, it's you. Love always, Grandpa William. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope, my mind racing. He'd thought of everything, planned for every contingency, but what he couldn't plan for was whether I had the strength to actually follow through. I spent the rest of the morning reading through the files in the desk, trying to understand the scope of what I'd inherited. Frost Maritime Holdings wasn't just one company, but a network of subsidiaries and partnerships, shipping contracts with manufacturers across 3 continents. A fleet of cargo vessels, some owned outright, others leased, warehouse facilities in Boston, Baltimore, and Charleston. Investments in port infrastructure, logistics technology, even a small renewable energy venture that my grandfather had apparently started as a hedge against the industry's environmental impact. The numbers were staggering. Annual revenue in the hundreds of millions, thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended on decisions made in boardrooms I'd never set foot in. And somehow I was supposed to be in charge of all of it. By noon my phone had accumulated 17 missed calls and 23 text messages. Most were from family members, but there were also several from numbers I didn't recognize, journalists probably, trying to get a statement about the unexpected inheritance. I ignored all of them except one, a text from Daniel Mitchell. Just checking in, how are you holding up? I texted back, overwhelmed but still here. His response came quickly. Good. That's all you need to be right now. The transition team wants to meet with you this week. Are you available Thursday morning? I stared at the message. Thursday was 3 days away. 3 days to prepare myself for a meeting with people who actually knew what they were doing, who would be evaluating whether the old man's faith in me was justified or delusional. Yes, I typed, I'll be there. The rest of the day passed in a strange blur. I walked the grounds of the estate, retracing paths I'd followed as a child. The gardens were immaculate, maintained by staff I'd glimpsed, but never really seen. There was a greenhouse near the property's edge, glass panes catching the afternoon light, and inside I found rows of orchids in various stages of bloom. My grandfather had loved orchids, I remembered suddenly. He'd spent hours in here, tending them with a patience he rarely showed anywhere else. I found myself thinking about all the versions of him I'd known. The stern businessman in his tailored suits who commanded boardrooms, the quiet man who'd shown up to my college graduation when no one else had. The patient teacher who taught me to sail when I was 8, his big hands steady on my small ones as I learned to tie knots. Which one was real? Maybe they all were. Maybe that was what I'd never understood about him until now, that people could be complicated, could contain multitudes, could be both hard and soft depending on what the moment required. As the sun started to set, I went back inside and found myself in the conservatory where the will had been read just 24 hours ago. The room looked different in the fading light, softer somehow, less like a courtroom, and more like just another beautiful room in a beautiful house. I sat in the chair I'd occupied yesterday, the one in the corner, and tried to imagine sitting somewhere else next time. At the head of the table maybe, or at least closer to the center. The thought made my stomach twist with anxiety, but also with something else, something that might have been determination. My phone buzzed, another text from Cassandra. I know you're reading these, we grew up together, Elena, you owe me at least a conversation. I stared at the message for a long time. Did I owe her that? We'd shared a childhood, sure, but that didn't mean we'd been close. She'd been Judith's golden child, perfect grades, perfect manners, perfect everything. And I'd been the one who didn't quite fit, who asked too many questions, who wanted to paint instead of network, who eventually stopped trying to compete for approval I was never going to get. But maybe she was right. Maybe I did owe her something, if not for her sake, then for mine. If I was going to do this, if I was really going to step into the role my grandfather had left for me, I couldn't just hide from my family forever. I had to face them, had to figure out if there was any way forward that didn't involve complete estrangement. I typed back, okay, tomorrow, 2 o'clock, here. Her response was immediate, thank you, I'll be there. I put my phone away and sat in the gathering darkness, wondering what I'd just agreed to and whether I'd regret it. Outside, the ocean continued its endless rhythm, indifferent to human drama, indifferent to inheritance disputes and family feuds, and the weight of legacies no one asked for, but somehow had to carry anyway. That night, I didn't sleep any better than I had the night before. I kept thinking about the meeting with Cassandra, playing out different scenarios in my head. Would she try to guilt me into giving up the inheritance? Threaten me with legal action? Or would she actually try to rebuild some kind of relationship, find common ground in the ruins of our family? I didn't know which possibility scared me more. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely and went back down to the library. I turned on a single lamp, the one on the desk, and pulled out more of my grandfather's files. If I was going to do this, I needed to understand not just what I'd inherited, but who I'd inherited it from. I found photo albums in one of the lower drawers, old ones with black pages, and those little corner holders for prints. Pictures from decades ago, from before I was born. My grandfather, as a young man, standing on the deck of a ship, his hair dark and thick, his smile confident. My grandmother beside him in another photo, elegant in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of Judith. Pictures of my father as a boy, then as a young man, his face still open and unguarded in a way I'd never seen in person. And then pictures of us, the grandchildren. Brandon learning to sail, his face screwed up in concentration. Cassandra in a white dress at some formal event, already practicing that perfect smile. And me younger than I remembered being, covered in paint, holding up a picture I'd drawn. My grandfather stood behind me in that photo, his hand on my shoulder, and he was looking at my drawing with an expression I recognize now. Pride, not the performative kind that got trotted out at dinners and announced to rooms full of people, but the quiet kind, the real kind. I closed the album and sat back in the chair, my throat tight. He'd been building to this for years, I realized. All those small gestures, those moments of attention, those notes and visits and quiet encouragements, he'd been preparing me, teaching me that my worth wasn't dependent on their approval, that I could build a life on my own terms. And now he was asking me to take everything he'd learned, everything he'd built,
and make it into something better. The question was whether I was brave enough to try. When dawn finally broke, I was still sitting at that desk, surrounded by files and photos and the weight of impossible decisions, but I wasn't running. Not yet, and maybe I thought, as the first light touched the ocean beyond the windows, maybe that was enough to start with. Helen found me there an hour later, brought me coffee and toast that I barely tasted. Miss Cassandra called, she said quietly. She confirmed for 2 o'clock this afternoon. I've prepared the sitting room. I thought it might be more comfortable than the conservatory. I nodded, grateful for her thoughtfulness. Thank you, Helen. She hesitated in the doorway. For what it's worth, I think Mr. Frost made the right choice. I've watched all of you grow up, and you're the only one who ever said thank you, who ever asked my name, who ever treated any of us like we mattered. That means something. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I just smiled, and she left me alone with my coffee and my mounting dread of the afternoon ahead. At 1:30, I went upstairs and changed into something slightly more presentable, dark slacks, and a blouse that looked professional without trying too hard. I brushed my hair, put on minimal makeup, and stared at myself in the mirror. I looked tired, uncertain, nothing like the confident heiress I was supposed to be. But I also looked determined, and maybe that would have to be enough. At 2 o'clock exactly, I heard the doorbell. Helen showed Cassandra into the sitting room, and I stood as she entered, my hands clasped in front of me to keep them from shaking. She looked different than she had at the will reading, less polished somehow. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore jeans and a sweater, dressed down in a way I'd rarely seen her. For a moment, we just looked at each other across the Persian rug, two people who'd shared a childhood but somehow ended up as strangers. Thank you for seeing me, Cassandra said finally, and her voice was different too, quieter, without that edge of superiority I'd grown so accustomed to. I gestured to the chairs by the fireplace. We should sit. We did, perched on opposite ends of the antique sofa like birds ready to take flight at the first sign of danger. The silence stretched between us, heavy with all the things we'd never said to each other, all the years of distance, and resentment, and complicated family politics. I don't know where to start, she admitted, and I was surprised to hear what sounded like genuine uncertainty in her voice. I've been angry since the reading. Furious, actually. I kept thinking about how unfair it was, how I'd done everything right, and you'd gotten everything anyway. I waited, not sure where this was going, but then I went home, and I couldn't stop thinking about what Grandpa said in that video. About the whistleblower, about how I'd destroyed her career, because she asked questions I didn't want to answer. She looked down at her hands, twisted together in her lap. It was true, all of it. I told myself I was protecting the foundation, protecting the family's reputation, but really, I was just protecting myself from having to admit I'd made mistakes. This wasn't what I'd expected. I'd braced myself for manipulation, for attempts to make me feel guilty or unworthy. I hadn't prepared for honesty. I've spent my whole life trying to be perfect, Cassandra continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Perfect grades, perfect career, perfect daughter. And somewhere along the way, I forgot that being perfect isn't the same as being good. Grandpa knew that. I think that's why he left everything to you. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her it was okay, that we all made mistakes. But another part of me, the part that remembered every dismissal, every time I'd been made to feel like I didn't belong, held back. What do you want from me, Cassandra? I asked finally, and I tried to keep my voice neutral, not accusatory, but not warm either. She looked up at me, and I was startled to see tears in her eyes. I don't know, maybe I just wanted you to know that I heard him. I heard what he said, and he was right about me. I don't expect you to forgive me for how I treated you. I don't even know if I deserve forgiveness. But I couldn't just let this sit between us without at least trying to acknowledge it. The strange thing was, I believed her. Maybe that made me naive, maybe I was setting myself up to be manipulated. But sitting there in that room, where we'd spent countless childhood hours playing games we'd both forgotten the rules to, I saw something in her face that looked like genuine remorse. I remember when we were kids, I said slowly, before everything got so complicated. We used to build forts out of couch cushions, and here, you always insisted on being the architect, designing the whole thing, and I just followed your instructions." A small sad smile crossed her face. "You were always so patient with me, even when I was bossy." "You were always bossy," I said, and was surprised when it came out sounding almost fond. "But you were also the one who taught me to swim. That summer I was 6, and terrified of the water. You spent hours with me in the shallow end, holding my hand, telling me I could do it." She wiped at her eyes. "I'd forgotten that, so had I, until just now." We sat in silence for a moment, and it felt different than the hostile silence at the will reading. This felt like possibility, fragile and uncertain, but real. "I can't give you the company," I said, "because I needed to be clear about that. I can't give you the house, or the money, or any of it. Not because I want to punish you, but because Grandpa left it to me for a reason, and I think I owe it to him to at least try to understand what that reason was." Cassandra nodded. "I know. I'm not here to ask you to give it up. I think part of me needed to come here and see if you were gloating, if you were enjoying having power over us for once, but you're not, are you? You're just as terrified as I would be." "Completely terrified," I admitted. "I have no idea what I'm doing. I spent half of last night reading through business reports I barely understand, trying to figure out what a shipping manifest even is." She laughed, a real laugh, not the polished social laugh I was used to hearing from her. "A shipping manifest is just a detailed list of cargo. It's not as complicated as it sounds." "Everything sounds complicated right now," I said. We talked for another hour, carefully navigating around the bigger hurts, the deeper wounds. We talked about the business, about Portland, about her work at the foundation before everything fell apart. She told me about the whistleblower, a woman named Patricia, who'd discovered that donation money earmarked for educational programs was being funneled into administrative costs, which was a polite way of saying it was paying for the foundation board's expensive lunches and travel expenses. "I could have fixed it," Cassandra said. "I could have admitted the mistake, restructured the budget, made it right, but Mother was on the board, and she said it would make us look incompetent, that we needed to handle it quietly, so I did. I had Patricia fired, made sure she couldn't get hired anywhere else in the nonprofit sector, and buried the whole thing under layers of paperwork and legal threats." "That must be hard to live with," I said quietly. "It is. It keeps me up at night sometimes, wondering where she is now, if she's okay, if she ever found another job." I told myself I was doing what was necessary, but really I was just being a coward. There was something brave about her honesty, something that made me think maybe people really could change, or at least recognize when they needed to. "What are you going to do now?" I asked. She shrugged. "I don't know. The foundation fired me 2 days after the will reading. Apparently, the board decided I was a liability. Mother tried to fight it, but they'd already made up their minds, so I'm unemployed, living off my inheritance, and trying to figure out who I am when I'm not performing perfection for everyone." "That sounds lonely," I said. "It is." She stood up, smoothing her sweater in a gesture that reminded me painfully of our mother. "I should go. I've taken up enough of your time. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry, for all of it. For every time I made you feel like you weren't good enough, every time I acted like you were an embarrassment to the family, you deserved better, and I'm sorry I didn't give it to you." I stood too, and before I could think better of it, I pulled her into a hug. She stiffened for a moment, surprised, then hugged me back. We stood there in the sitting room, two sisters who'd spent years as strangers, holding on to each other like we were both drowning, and didn't know who was supposed to save whom. "I don't know if we can fix this," I said into her shoulder. "I don't know if we can go back to being family, whatever that means." "I don't know either," she said, "but maybe we could try to figure it out." When she left, I felt simultaneously lighter and heavier, lighter because some of the anger I'd been carrying had loosened its grip, heavier because forgiveness was complicated and messy, and didn't come with a clear roadmap. I spent the rest of the afternoon walking on the beach below the manor, my shoes in my hand, the cold Atlantic water rushing over my feet. Thursday morning arrived faster than I wanted it to. I dressed carefully, choosing a suit I'd bought years ago for a job interview and barely worn since. It was charcoal gray, professional but not flashy, and I hoped it would make me look more competent than I felt. Helen had set out breakfast in the dining room, but I could barely eat, my stomach twisted with nerves. Daniel had sent me the address for the meeting, a law office in downtown Newport, along with the names of the people who'd be there. James Hartwell, Chief Financial Officer of Frost Maritime, Patricia Lowell, Head of Operations, Marcus Chen, the company's General Counsel, and David Foster, who'd apparently been my grandfather's closest advisor for the past 20 years. I drove myself into town, not wanting the formality of a car service, not ready to start acting like the kind of person who had a car service. The law office was in a historic building near the waterfront, all brick and brass, and the kind of old money elegance that Newport specialized in. A receptionist directed me to a conference room on the third floor, and I climbed the stairs slowly, each step, feeling like I was walking toward some kind of judgment I wasn't prepared for. They were already there when I arrived, 4 people seated around a polished table, all of them looking up as I entered. I recognized James Hartwell from photos in the company files, a man in his 50s with silver hair, and the kind of face that suggested he didn't smile often. Patricia Lowell was younger, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense air about her. Marcus Chen had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and David Foster was older, probably 70, with deep wrinkles and an expression I couldn't quite read. "Miss Frost," Daniel said, standing up from where he'd been sitting at the head of the table. "Thank you for coming, please sit down." I took the empty chair across from them, feeling like I was back in school being called to the principal's office. "I know this must be overwhelming," David Foster said, and his voice was gentle, grandfatherly almost. "William spoke very highly of you, but he also acknowledged that he was asking you to step into a role you hadn't trained for. We're here to help, not to judge. Though we will need to understand your intentions," James Hartwell added, and his tone was considerably less warm. "The company has responsibilities, shareholders, employees who depend on stable leadership. With all due respect, you don't have experience in this industry." "I know," I said, and was grateful my voice came out steady. "I'm not going to pretend I know what I'm doing, because I don't, but my grandfather believed I could learn, and I'd like the chance to try." Patricia Lowell leaned forward. "What exactly does trying look like to you? Are you planning to take an active role in operations, or would you prefer to remain a figurehead, while we continue managing day-to-day functions?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been wrestling with for days. "I want to understand the business first," I said carefully. "I can't make informed decisions if I don't know how things work, so I'd like to spend the next few months learning, shadowing each of you, understanding what you do and why. And then, once I have a better grasp of things, I'd like to start making decisions about direction, about whether we're operating in line with the values my grandfather originally built this company on." James's eyes narrowed slightly. "And if we're not, if you decide we need to make changes, then we'll make changes," I said, meeting his gaze, "but I'm not going to walk in and start overturning things without understanding them first. I'm not that arrogant." Marcus Chen smiled slightly. "That's a refreshing attitude. Most people who inherit power can't wait to exercise it." "I didn't ask for this power," I said. "I'm not sure I even want it, but it's mine now, and I'm not going to waste it or abuse it just because I'm scared." David Foster nodded approvingly. "William said you had integrity." I'm glad to see he was right. We spent the next 3 hours going through the basics of the company structure, the various divisions, and how they operated. James walked me through the financial side, the revenue streams and cost structures, the quarterly projections, and 5-year plans. Patricia explained the operations, the fleet management and crew scheduling, the maintenance protocols, and safety regulations. Marcus covered the legal landscape, the contracts and compliance requirements, the various regulatory bodies that governed maritime shipping, and David, who turned out to be equal parts strategist and historian, told me stories about my grandfather, about the decisions he'd made over the decades, and the principles that had guided him. William had a saying, David told me near the end of the meeting. He'd say that you could either build a company to make money, or build a company to make a difference, but if you were smart enough, you could do both. The key was never sacrificing the second for the first. But that's exactly what's been happening, I said, thinking about the letter my grandfather had left me, about the safety violations and ethical compromises. Hasn't it? The room went quiet. James shifted uncomfortably. Patricia's expression hardened. There have been difficult decisions, James said finally. The industry is competitive. Margins are tight. Sometimes you have to make choices that aren't ideal, but are necessary for survival. My grandfather didn't think those choices were necessary, I said. He thought they were convenient. With respect, Miss Frost, your grandfather wasn't dealing with the realities of the current market, James shot back. Things have changed since he was actively running operations. The company he built was admirable, but it was also inefficient by modern standards. Inefficient how? I asked. Inefficient in that we were paying above-market wages to crews, maintaining vessels to standards beyond what regulations required, turning down contracts that would have been enormously profitable, but came with ethical gray areas, James said, his frustration evident. I'm not saying we did anything illegal, but we certainly weren't maximizing our potential. Maybe maximizing profit wasn't the potential he cared about, I said quietly. Patricia spoke up, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost sympathetic. Look, we all respected William, but James has a point. The world's different now. Companies that can't compete don't survive, and companies that don't survive can't employ anyone. There's a balance that has to be struck. I understand that, I said, but I also understand that my grandfather spent 15 years watching that balance shift, watching the company become something he didn't recognize anymore, and in the end he decided it needed to change. That's why I'm here. So what are you proposing? Marcus asked. I'm not proposing anything yet, I said. Like I said, I need to learn first, but I want full transparency. I want to see the contracts we've taken on, the decisions that have been made, all of it. And I want to understand not just what we're doing but why, and whether there are alternatives we haven't considered. James looked like he wanted to argue, but David cut him off. That's fair. William left Alina in charge, because he trusted her judgment. The least we can do is give her the information she needs to exercise that judgment wisely. The meeting ended with a schedule worked out for the next 3 months. I'd spend time with each division, learning the operations from the ground up. James wasn't happy about it, that much was clear, but he agreed to cooperate. As everyone filed out, David hung back, waiting until we were alone. You handled that well, he said. James is going to be a problem. He's not interested in changing how things work, because how things work has made him very wealthy, but he's also smart enough not to push too hard too fast. He'll wait, see if you stumble, and then use that stumbling as evidence that you're not cut out for this. Great, I said, so I have to be perfect. No, David said firmly, you have to be yourself. That's what William saw in you, Alina. You're not perfect, but you're honest. You're not experienced, but you're willing to learn. And most importantly, you actually care about doing the right thing, not just the profitable thing. That's rarer than you'd think in this world. It doesn't feel like enough, I admitted. It's more than enough, but it won't be easy. There are going to be people who resent you, who think you don't deserve to be here. Some of them will try to undermine you, others will just wait for you to fail. You need to be ready for that. How do I get ready for that? I asked. He smiled. You build a team you can trust, you find the people who share your values, and you hold on to them, and you remember why you're doing this. Not for the money or the power, or to prove something to your family, but because William believed you could make this company into something better than it's been. Don't let anyone talk you out of that belief, including yourself. When I got back to the manor that evening, exhausted and overwhelmed, and strangely exhilarated, I found another envelope waiting for me on the hall table. My name was written on it in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a short note on plain paper. Miss Frost, my name is Patricia Manning. You don't know me, but your sister Cassandra ruined my career 3 years ago, because I tried to report financial irregularities at the Hastings Foundation. I saw the news about your inheritance. I don't expect anything from you, but I wanted you to know that not everyone in your family's orbit is corrupt or complicit. Some of us tried to do the right thing, we just got crushed for it. I hope you do better than they did. Sincerely, Patricia Manning. I read the note 3 times, my hands shaking. This was the woman Cassandra had told me about, the whistleblower, whose life she'd destroyed, and somehow she'd found out where I was, had taken the time to write to me, to reach out across the damage that had been done to her.
Didn't know what to do with that? I didn't know if there was anything I could do. But I folded the note carefully and put it in the desk drawer with my grandfather's letter, another piece of the puzzle I was trying to assemble. That night, I called my best friend from Portland, a woman named Iris who ran the community center where I'd been working. I hadn't talked to her since before the will reading, hadn't known how to explain what was happening or what it meant. "Elena," she said when she answered, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "I've been worried about you. Are you okay?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "Everything's changed, Iris. Everything." I told her the whole story, or as much of it as I could get through without crying. She listened without interrupting, letting me pour it all out. The inheritance, the family drama, the overwhelming responsibility I'd never asked for. "So what are you going to do?" she asked. When I finally ran out of words, "I think I'm going to stay," I said, and as I said it, I realized it was true. "I think I'm going to try to do what he asked me to do. Even though it scares you, especially because it scares me. I spent so long running from this family, from their expectations and their judgments and their version of success. But maybe that was just another way of letting them define me. Maybe the bravest thing I can do is stay and define myself on my own terms." "You sound like you're trying to convince yourself," Iris said gently. "I am," I admitted. "I'm terrified I'm going to fail. I'm terrified they're going to be right about me, that I'm not smart enough or tough enough or business savvy enough to do this. But you're going to try anyway." "Yeah, I'm going to try anyway." After we hung up, I sat in the library with all the lights off, looking out at the dark ocean. Somewhere out there ships were moving through the night, carrying cargo across vast distances, part of the network my grandfather had built, and I was now responsible for. It felt impossible, but then again, most worthwhile things did. The next 3 months passed in a blur of learning curves so steep they felt vertical. I spent mornings with Patricia in operations, learning how to read shipping schedules and understand the intricate choreography of getting cargo from one port to another. She was patient with me, more patient than I deserved, explaining things multiple times when I didn't understand, walking me through the logistics software until I could navigate it without help. I learned about tonnage and deadweight, about container specifications and customs regulations, about all the invisible infrastructure that kept global commerce moving. Afternoons were usually with James in finance, which was considerably less pleasant. He answered my questions with barely concealed impatience, clearly viewing my education as an inconvenience he had to tolerate. But I pushed through, learning to read balance sheets and cash flow statements, understanding profit margins and operational costs. The numbers told stories if you knew how to read them, stories about where money came from and where it went, about what the company valued and what it was willing to sacrifice. And sometimes those stories made me uncomfortable. There was a contract with a textile manufacturer in Bangladesh that paid well but involved shipping schedules so tight that crews were regularly working beyond safe fatigue limits. There was a cost-cutting measure that had reduced maintenance budgets to barely adequate levels, saving money in the short term but potentially creating safety issues down the line. There were dozens of small decisions that individually seemed reasonable, but collectively painted a picture of a company that had drifted from its moorings, that had started prioritizing efficiency over everything else. I kept notes documenting everything I learned, every concern that arose, every question that didn't have a satisfactory answer. David had told me to build a team I could trust, and I was starting to understand what that meant. Patricia, I thought, could be part of that team. She was honest about the challenges, didn't try to sugarcoat the difficult realities of the industry, but she also seemed uncomfortable with some of the choices that had been made. Marcus, too, the general counsel, who had pulled me aside one afternoon to quietly mention that there were contracts he'd advised against that had been approved anyway over his objections. James was a different story. The more time I spent with him, the clearer it became that he saw me as a temporary inconvenience, someone to be managed until I either gave up or could be maneuvered into a figurehead position, where I'd sign whatever he put in front of me without asking difficult questions. He'd underestimated me, though. I could see it in the way he'd started to get sloppy, letting me see documents he probably should have kept hidden, making comments that revealed more than he intended. One afternoon in late June, I was reviewing a proposed contract with a mining company when I noticed something odd in the terms. The payment structure was complicated, routed through several intermediary companies in ways that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. I took it to Marcus. "Can you explain this to me?" I asked, spreading the documents across his desk. "This routing seems unnecessarily complex." He studied the papers, his expression growing more serious as he read. "Where did you get this?" "James gave it to me. Said it was a standard contract, wanted me to review it as part of my education." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "This isn't standard. This is exactly the kind of structure you use when you're trying to hide the origin or destination of funds. I've seen setups like this in money laundering cases." My stomach dropped. "Are you saying this is illegal?" "I'm saying it's suspicious enough that I'd want to investigate before signing anything." "Who brought us this contract?" I checked the file. According to the notes, it came through a broker James has worked with before. The mining company is based in Brazil, but the payment routing goes through companies in Panama and the Cayman Islands. "I don't like this," Marcus said flatly. "I'm going to need time to look into it properly, but my initial instinct is that we should decline. The money might be good, but if this is what I think it is, it could expose the company to serious legal liability. Then we decline," I said. He looked surprised. "Just like that. Just like that. My grandfather built this company on the principle that a handshake meant something, that our reputation was worth more than any single contract. I'm not going to compromise that for money I don't even need." Marcus smiled, and it transformed his usually serious face. "William would be proud of you." When I told James we were declining the contract, his reaction confirmed my suspicions. He argued strenuously, insisting I was being overcautious, that this was how international business worked, that I'd cost the company millions in revenue over unfounded concerns. "Marcus thinks the payment structure is suspicious," I said calmly. "He's concerned about legal exposure." "Marcus is overcautious about everything," James shot back. "If we listened to every one of his concerns, we'd never do business with anyone outside the United States. Then maybe we need to be more selective about who we do business with," I said. "This contract makes me uncomfortable, and until I understand it better, I'm not approving it." "You're not approving it," James repeated, and there was something ugly in his voice now. "With all due respect, Elena, you've been here 3 months. You barely understand how to read a shipping manifest. You're not qualified to make strategic decisions about which contracts we should take." "Maybe not," I said, holding his gaze, "but I am qualified to decide what kind of company I want us to be, and I don't want us to be the kind of company that takes contracts we can't fully explain or defend." He left my office furious, and I sat there shaking, wondering if I'd just made a catastrophic mistake. But when I called David to tell him what happened, he laughed. "Good for you," he said. "James has been pushing boundaries for years, seeing how much he could get away with. William reined him in when he was alive, but after the stroke last year, James started making more decisions unilaterally. It's about time someone reminded him he doesn't run this company. He's going to make things difficult," I said. "He's going to try, but you've got the board meeting coming up next month, and that's your chance to establish real authority. Show them you're not just William's sentimental choice, that you actually have a vision for where this company should go." The board meeting. I'd been dreading it since I first learned it was scheduled. The Frost Maritime Board consisted of 8 members, including me as the new majority shareholder. 4 of them were external members, investors and business leaders who'd been appointed over the years. 3 were internal, James, Patricia and Marcus, and then there was me, theoretically in charge, but practically untested.
I spent the 2 weeks before the meeting preparing, working with David to put together a presentation about the company's direction, not radical changes. I'd learned enough to know that trying to overhaul everything at once would be disastrous. But meaningful shifts, a return to some of the principles my grandfather had built on, updated for modern realities. We'd reinstate higher safety standards, even if it meant higher costs. We'd be more selective about contracts, prioritizing long-term relationships with ethical partners over short-term profits from questionable sources. We'd increase wages for crew members and invest more in maintenance and training, and yes, it would impact profit margins, at least initially, but I had to believe, that running a company with integrity would pay off in the long run. The morning of the board meeting, I woke up before dawn, too anxious to sleep. I dressed carefully in a navy suit, professional but not trying too hard to be something I wasn't. Helen had laid out breakfast, but I could only manage coffee, my stomach too twisted to handle food. I drove to the Boston headquarters, a sleek glass building near the waterfront that felt nothing like the historic elegance of Newport. The meeting was scheduled for 10, and I arrived at 9:30, wanting time to settle myself before facing the board. David met me in the lobby. "Ready?" he asked. "Absolutely not," I said. "But I'm here anyway." He smiled. "That's the spirit." The boardroom was on the top floor, all glass walls and modern furniture, with a view of the harbor that would have been stunning if I'd been in any state to appreciate it. The board members were already gathering, helping themselves to coffee and pastries, making small talk. I recognized some of them from photos. Thomas Brennan, a retired shipping executive who'd known my grandfather for 40 years. Linda Huang, a finance expert who joined the board 5 years ago. Robert Castellano, who ran a logistics company and had been appointed during my father's brief tenure on the board. James was there, of course, looking confident and composed, chatting with Robert like they were old friends, which they probably were. Patricia gave me a small encouraging nod when I entered. Marcus was reviewing papers, his expression thoughtful, and then there was a woman I didn't recognize, younger than the others, maybe in her early 40s, with dark hair and an air of quiet competence. "Elena," David said. "I don't think you've met Jennifer Park yet. She joined the board 6 months ago, representing the Harrison Investment Group." Jennifer stood and extended her hand. "It's good to finally meet you, Miss Frost. Your grandfather spoke highly of you in our last few meetings together." We took our seats, and I found myself at the head of the table, a position that felt simultaneously powerful and terrifying. Thomas Brennan called the meeting to order, and we moved through the preliminary business, approval of last quarter's minutes, financial reports, routine matters. Then it was my turn. "I'd like to discuss the company's strategic direction," I began, and was grateful my voice came out steady. "I've spent the last 3 months learning about our operations, understanding how we work and why, and I've identified some areas where I believe we've drifted from the principles this company was founded on." I walked them through my presentation, laying out the concerns about safety standards, about contract selection, about the balance between profitability and integrity. I presented the data I'd gathered, showed them examples of decisions that prioritized short-term gains over long-term stability, and I proposed changes, specific measurable shifts in how we operated. James interrupted halfway through. "If I may," he said, his tone carefully polite, but with an edge underneath. "While I appreciate Elena's enthusiasm, I think we need to be realistic about what these changes would mean financially. She's proposing measures that could reduce our profit margins by as much as 15%. That's not sustainable in a competitive market." "It's not sustainable if we're only thinking about the next quarter," I countered. "But if we're thinking about the next decade, about building a company that people actually want to work for and do business with, then maybe it's exactly what we need." "That's a lovely sentiment," Robert said, and his tone made it clear what he thought of lovely sentiments. "But this company has shareholders beyond you, Miss Frost. We have responsibilities to provide returns on investment. Your grandfather understood that. My grandfather also understood that returns mean nothing if you destroy your reputation getting them, I said. He spent 50 years building a company that people trusted. I've spent the last 3 months watching how quickly that trust has been eroded by decisions that prioritize profit over everything else. Linda Huang spoke up, her voice measured. Can you give us specific examples? I could, and did. The Bangladesh contract with the impossible schedules, the maintenance budgets cut to barely adequate levels, the mining contract I'd declined that James had pushed for, despite obvious red flags. As I laid it out, I watched the board members' faces, trying to gauge their reactions. Thomas looked troubled. Jennifer was taking notes, her expression thoughtful. Linda seemed to be calculating something. Robert and James looked angry. What you're describing, Thomas said slowly when I finished, sounds like we've lost our way somewhat. I wasn't aware the safety margins had been cut that thin. That's because James assured us the cuts were modest and well within acceptable parameters, Robert said, shooting a look at James. Which they are, James insisted. Elena is interpreting routine cost management as negligence. Every company in this industry operates with similar margins. We're not doing anything unusual, except that we used to do better, I said. We used to be the company that other companies looked to as a model. When did we decide that being merely adequate was good enough? The debate went on for another hour. Arguments and counter-arguments, data and projections, and philosophical disagreements about what a company's responsibilities actually were. I held my ground, refused to back down, even when Robert accused me of being naive and idealistic, even when James implied I was unqualified to make these kinds of decisions. Finally, Thomas called for a vote. We need to decide if we're going to implement the changes Elena is proposing or continue with our current operational model. All in favor of Elena's proposal. I voted yes, obviously, so did Thomas, clearly troubled by what he'd learned. Marcus voted yes, and Patricia, after a moment's hesitation. Jennifer Park surprised me by voting yes as well, with a comment that the Harrison Investment Group preferred to invest in companies with strong ethical frameworks. That was 5. Linda and Robert voted no, arguing the financial impact was too severe, and James of course voted no, 5-3. The changes would be implemented. James's face went carefully blank, but I could see the fury underneath. Robert looked disgusted, but the others seemed cautiously optimistic, and I felt something loosen in my chest, some knot of anxiety that had been there since the day I inherited all of this. After the meeting, Jennifer caught up with me in the hallway. That took courage, she said. I'm not sure courage is the right word, I said. Stubbornness maybe. She laughed. Sometimes they're the same thing. For what it's worth, I think William made the right choice. I've been watching this company for a while, and it needed someone to steer it back toward its roots. I'm glad you're willing to do that. Even if it costs money, I asked. Money you can make back, she said. Reputation once lost is much harder to recover. I drove back to Newport that evening, exhausted but also strangely energized. I'd done it. I'd faced the board, stood my ground, and won. It wasn't over. I knew that. James would push back, would look for ways to undermine the changes or prove I was wrong, but for now, I'd established that I was actually in charge, that I wasn't just a figurehead to be managed and ignored. When I got back to the manor, I found another letter waiting, this one in familiar handwriting, from Cassandra. Elena, it read. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, about what Grandpa said, about what I did. I can't undo the past, but I'd like to try to do better going forward. I reached out to Patricia Manning. It took me 2 weeks to find her. She's been working at a small nonprofit in Vermont, making a fraction of what she used to earn. I apologized. I don't know if it was enough, probably not, but I told her what I'd done was wrong, that I'd abused my power because I was afraid of looking incompetent, and I offered to help her. Not money. She made it clear she didn't want that from me, but references, connections, whatever I could do to help repair the damage I caused. She said she'd think about it. I don't know if she'll forgive me. I'm not sure I deserve it, but I wanted you to know I'm trying. Maybe we could have lunch sometime. No family, no agenda, just sisters. Cassandra. I read the letter twice, then called her. She answered on the second ring. Elena. Lunch sounds good, I said. When are you free? We met 3 days later at a small cafe in Providence, halfway between Newport and Boston, neutral territory. She looked different again, more casual, more real somehow. We talked for 2 hours, carefully at first, then with increasing ease. She told me about her job search, about how hard it was to find work when you'd been fired for cause from a prominent foundation. I told her about the board meeting, about standing up to James and actually winning. I'm proud of you, she said, and I could tell she meant it. Grandpa would be too. I keep wondering if I'm doing this right, I admitted, if I'm making the right choices. I don't think there is a right way, she said. I think there's just your way, and trusting that it's enough. We didn't solve everything that day. Years of hurt don't disappear over lunch, but it was a start, and starts mattered. Over the following months, the changes I'd implemented began to take effect. We renegotiated the Bangladesh contract with realistic schedules. Even though it meant reduced revenue, we increased maintenance budgets and hired additional safety inspectors. We turned down several lucrative contracts that came with ethical red flags, and yes, our profit margins took a hit. James fought me at every turn, questioning every decision, demanding justification for every expense, but the board backed me, even Linda eventually coming around when she saw that our reputation in the industry was actually improving, that clients were starting to seek us out specifically because we were known for reliability and ethical operations. The financial impact wasn't as severe as James had predicted, and the long-term benefits were already becoming apparent. By December, nearly a year after my grandfather's death, I'd settled into the role in a way I never expected. I split my time between Newport and Boston, between the manor that was slowly starting to feel like home, and the corporate office where I was gradually earning respect. I'd built my team, Patricia as my chief operations officer, Marcus as my closest advisor, David still providing strategic guidance, and I'd started to implement some of my own ideas, not just returning to my grandfather's principles, but adapting them, finding ways to honor his legacy while building something that reflected who I was. Christmas approached, and with it came the question of what to do about family. My parents had barely spoken to me since the will reading. Brandon had made a few half-hearted attempts at reconciliation that felt more like fishing expeditions to see if I'd be open to giving him a role in the company, but Cassandra and I had been meeting regularly, slowly rebuilding something that resembled a sisterly relationship. "Are you doing anything for Christmas?" she asked during one of our lunches in November. "I haven't decided," I said. "Part of me wants to ignore it entirely." "Mother's been asking about you," Cassandra said carefully, not nicely, but asking. "What does she want?" "I think she wants to pretend everything's normal. That's how she deals with things. Pretending. If she acts like nothing's wrong long enough, maybe it'll become true." "That's not how anything works," I said. "I know, but I also know she's lonely. Father barely talks anymore, just sits in his study, reading the same books over and over. Brandon's busy with the Cape Cod house, throwing parties pretending he's still relevant, and I'm the daughter who got fired and apologized to the woman she destroyed. We're not exactly the family she imagined. That's not my responsibility," I said. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. Cassandra was right about one thing: we were family, broken and complicated and full of damage, but still family. And my grandfather had given me not just his company, but also the choice of what to do with the power that came with it. I could use it to exclude them the way they'd excluded me, to punish them for all the years of dismissal and contempt, or I could try to do what he'd done for me, see them clearly, acknowledge their failures, but still believe they could be better. On Christmas Eve, I drove to my parents' house in Providence, the one they'd moved to after giving up the Newport estate. It was smaller, elegant but not grand, the house of people who'd lost something they couldn't quite name. Cassandra met me at the door. "They don't know you're coming," she said. "I thought it would be better as a surprise." "Or worse," I said. "That too," she admitted. Inside, the house was decorated for Christmas, tasteful and understated. I found my parents in the living room, my father in an armchair by the fireplace, my mother on the sofa with a book she wasn't really reading. They looked up when I entered, and for a moment no one spoke. "Alina," my mother said finally, and I couldn't read her expression. "Merry Christmas," I said, and was surprised to find I meant it. We had dinner, all four of us, the most stilted and awkward meal I'd ever sat through, but we sat through it. Made conversation about nothing important, avoided all the topics that mattered. Afterward, my father asked to speak with me privately. We went into his study, a room lined with books he probably had read, but didn't seem to understand anymore. "Your grandfather was right about me," he said without preamble. "I've spent my life letting other people make my decisions, staying quiet when I should have spoken up, especially about you." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I'm ashamed," he said simply. "Because you deserved a father who stood up for you, and I wasn't that. I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not sure I deserve forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I see it now, how badly I failed you." I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to accept the apology, to absolve him and move forward, but another part, the part that remembered every time he'd stayed silent when I needed him, wasn't ready to let it go that easily. "I appreciate you saying that," I said finally, "but words are easy, Dad. What matters is what you do next." He nodded, accepting that. We rejoined the others, and I left soon after, driving back to Newport through quiet Christmas Eve streets. Cassandra texted me an hour later. "Thank you for coming. It meant something even if we're all too broken to say so." I texted back, "We're working on it. That's all we can do." The new year brought new challenges, decisions about expansion, about fleet modernization, about how to position the company for the future, but I faced them with more confidence now, more certainty that I belonged here, that I'd earned my place not just through inheritance, but through the work I'd put in, the choices I'd made, the values I'd insisted on even when it would have been easier to compromise. In February, I received an email from Patricia Manning, the woman Cassandra had destroyed and then apologized to. "Dear Miss Frost," it read, "Your sister told me about the changes you've been implementing at Frost Maritime. I wanted you to know that what you're doing matters. In a world where most people choose convenience over conscience, you're choosing to be better. That gives me hope. Thank you, Patricia." I printed that email and put it in the desk drawer with my grandfather's letters, another piece of evidence that maybe I was doing this right after all. One evening in March, almost exactly a year after the will reading, I found myself back in the conservatory where it had all begun. I sat in the same chair, near the glass wall, no longer positioned as an outsider, but choosing to be there anyway. The sunset painted the ocean in shades of gold and amber, and I thought about everything that had changed in a year, everything I'd learned about myself, and about what it meant to inherit not just wealth, but responsibility. My grandfather had given me a choice, and I'd made it. I'd chosen to stay, to fight, to build something that honored his legacy, while also being authentically mine. It wasn't easy. Some days it felt impossible, but impossible things, I'd discovered, were often just difficult things that no one had been brave enough to try. I pulled out my phone and looked at the last text he'd sent me, the one I'd read 100 times over the past year. "Be brave, Alina. Always." I finally understood what he'd meant. Bravery wasn't the absence of fear, it was choosing to act despite the fear, to stand up for what you believed in even when you weren't sure you'd succeed, to keep trying even when failing seemed inevitable. I'd been brave. I was still being brave, and I would keep being brave, one day at a time, building the quiet thing he'd always told me to build, the thing that would matter long after the money and the power and the family drama had faded into memory. Outside, the ocean continued its endless rhythm, constant and unchanging, but I had changed. I was no longer the unwanted mistake, the family embarrassment, the one they'd tried so hard to erase. I was Elena Frost, and I knew exactly who that meant, and what that was worth, and that, I thought as the last light faded from the sky, was the greatest inheritance of all. Spring arrived with a persistence that surprised me, turning the grounds of Frost Manor into something almost magical. The gardens that had seemed so formal and untouchable when I first arrived now felt like they were blooming specifically for me, as if the estate itself had finally accepted that I belonged here. I'd started walking the grounds every morning, before heading to the office, letting the salt air and
the sound of waves clear my head before diving into whatever crisis or decision waited for me in Boston. It was during one of these walks in early April that I found something I'd completely forgotten existed. Tucked behind the greenhouse, nearly hidden by overgrown hedges, was a small studio building. The paint was peeling, the windows were dirty, but when I pushed open the door, I found myself standing in what had clearly been an art studio. My art studio, from when I was 17, before I'd left for college, and then for my own life in Portland. The easel was still there, dusty but intact. Dried paint tubes littered a workbench, their labels faded but still readable. And on the walls, protected somewhat by the dimness and the closed space, were paintings I'd done as a teenager, seascapes mostly, attempts to capture the way light moved across water, the way storms gathered on the horizon. They weren't very good, technically speaking. My brushwork had been uncertain, my color theory shaky, but there was something honest in them, something raw and real that I'd spent years trying to recapture in my later work. I stood there for a long time, remembering the girl who'd painted these, who'd believed that art could save her, that creativity could be a form of freedom. I'd abandoned this space when I left, too hurt and angry to take anything with me, except the absolute necessities. I'd told myself I was leaving it all behind, the family, the estate, the life they'd tried to force me into. But I'd also left behind this part of myself, this proof that I'd once created beauty in the midst of pain. Helen found me there an hour later, sitting on the dusty floor, surrounded by old canvases. "I wondered when you'd find this place again," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "Your grandfather kept it locked up after you left, said nobody was to touch it, that you might want it someday." "He kept it for me," I said, and my voice broke on the words. "He kept everything for you, Miss Elena. He always believed you'd come back." I spent the rest of that day cleaning out the studio, deciding what to keep and what to let go. Most of the old supplies were unusable, dried beyond salvation, but the space itself was sound, and I found myself imagining what it could become. Not a shrine to who I'd been, but a place where I could reconnect with that part of myself I'd set aside when I became CEO of a shipping empire. That evening, I called Iris in Portland. We'd been talking regularly since I'd inherited everything, but this felt different, more urgent somehow. "I found my old art studio," I told her, "the one I used before I left home." "How does it feel?" she asked. "Like finding a piece of myself I forgot existed." "Iris, I've been so focused on learning the business, on proving I can do this, that I've completely neglected everything else. I can't remember the last time I painted, the last time I did anything creative just for the sake of doing it." "So paint," she said simply. "You're the boss now, Elena. You can do whatever you want." "It's not that simple," I said. "There's so much to manage, so many decisions to make. I can't just take time off to paint." "Why not?" she asked. "Your grandfather didn't leave you that company so you could work yourself to death. He left it to you because he trusted you to run it in a way that honored both the business and yourself. If painting is part of who you are, then it's part of what you bring to leadership. Don't lose that. Her words stayed with me. That weekend, instead of reviewing reports or preparing for meetings, I went to an art supply store in Providence. I bought new paints, brushes, canvases, all the tools I'd need to start creating again. The woman at the register, an older lady with paint-stained fingers, smiled at my selections. "Starting a new project?" she asked. "More like restarting an old one," I said. I set up the studio over the next few days, working in the evenings after I got back from Boston. I cleaned the windows until light poured through them, replaced the dusty drop cloths, organized my new supplies on the old workbench, and then one evening, I stood in front of a blank canvas and realized I had no idea what to paint. Everything I'd created in Portland had been for the community center, for the therapy sessions I ran, art with a purpose beyond itself. Before that, in college, I'd painted what my professors assigned, what would get me good grades. I'd spent so long creating for others that I'd forgotten how to create for myself. I started with color, just spreading paint across the canvas with no plan, no design, blues and grays, the colors of the ocean outside my window, whites and silvers for the foam and spray, and then, almost without thinking, touches of gold, the way sunset sometimes caught the water and turned it precious. The painting that emerged over the next week wasn't anything I could have planned. It was abstract, more feeling than form, but it captured something essential about this place, about what it meant to stand on the edge of the continent and look out at infinity. I was working on it one evening when Cassandra stopped by unannounced. I heard her voice downstairs, talking to Helen, and then footsteps approaching the studio. "Elena," she called. "Helen said you'd be out here." She stopped in the doorway, taking in the transformed space, the painting on the easel. "Wow. I didn't know this place still existed." "Grandpa kept it for me," I said, wiping paint from my hands. "Of course he did." She came closer, studying the painting. "This is beautiful. I'd forgotten how talented you were." "I'd forgotten too," I admitted. We stood there together, looking at the canvas, and I felt something shift between us. Not forgiveness exactly, that was still too complicated, but understanding maybe. Recognition that we'd both lost things in our family's dysfunction, had both been shaped by expectations we couldn't meet or didn't want to. "I got a job," Cassandra said after a while. "A real one, not just something to fill time. It's with a nonprofit in Boston, doing program evaluation. It's a step down from what I used to do, and the pay is terrible, but it's honest work, work that actually helps people." "I'm proud of you," I said, and meant it. "Don't be too proud yet," she said with a wry smile. "I'm still figuring out how to be a person instead of a performance. But I'm trying." She paused. "Mother asked about you again. She wants to have lunch, just the two of you." I told her I'd ask, but that you'd probably say no. "What do you think I should do?" I asked. Cassandra considered the question seriously. "I think you should do whatever feels right for you. If you're not ready to see her, that's okay. If you never want to see her again, that's okay too. You don't owe her anything, Elena. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, not even basic civility if you don't want to give it," I prompted, hearing the unspoken word. "But she's lonely and lost, and finally starting to realize that the life she built was hollow. She's not going to say that, probably ever. She's not going to apologize the way you deserve. But I think she's suffering, and maybe that matters, or maybe it doesn't. I honestly don't know anymore." I thought about it for the rest of the week.
My mother, Judith Frost, the woman who'd spent my entire childhood making me feel inadequate, who'd whispered that I wasn't really a Hastings, who'd excluded me from family events and dismissed my accomplishments and treated me like an embarrassment. Did I owe her anything? Did her suffering, if Cassandra was right about it, obligate me to ease it? In the end, I agreed to lunch, not because I owed her anything, but because I was curious. Curious about who she was without the armor of superiority, without the family fortune to validate her choices, without the perfect life she'd tried so hard to construct. We met at a restaurant in Newport, nothing too formal, just a place with good food and quiet corners. She was already there when I arrived, and I was struck by how much older she looked. Not just aged, but diminished somehow, like someone had turned down her brightness. "Elena," she said, standing awkwardly, as if she wasn't sure whether to hug me or shake my hand. We settled on a brief, uncomfortable embrace. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." We ordered, made small talk about nothing important, circled around everything that mattered, like it was a pit we might fall into if we got too close. Finally, over coffee, she said what she'd apparently brought me here to say. "I've been thinking about the will reading, about what Father said in that video." I waited, giving her nothing. "He was right about me," she continued, her voice quiet. "About all of us, really, but especially about me. I spent so much time worrying about appearances, about what people thought of our family, that I forgot to actually be a family. And by the time I realized it, you were gone. I left because there was nothing for me here." I said, "Because you made it very clear I didn't belong." "I know," she said, and there were tears in her eyes now, carefully controlled but present. "I know I did that. I told myself I was preparing you for a difficult world, that I was teaching you resilience. But really it was just punishing you for being different, for not fitting the image I had of what a Frost daughter should be." "Why?" I asked. "Why did it matter so much that I wasn't like Cassandra or Brandon? Why couldn't you just let me be who I was?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup like it held answers. "Because you reminded me of myself," she said finally. "When I was young, before I married your father, I wanted to be a writer. I had notebooks full of stories, dreams of publishing novels, of creating something meaningful. But my mother told me that wasn't appropriate for someone of our standing, that I needed to focus on making a good marriage and maintaining our social position. So I did. I buried everything I wanted and became what was expected of me. And when you looked at me," I said slowly, understanding dawning, "you saw someone who was refusing to bury themselves, someone who was choosing their own path despite the cost. I saw someone braver than I'd ever been," she said, "and I hated you for it. Not consciously, not in a way I would have admitted even to myself, but I made you pay for having the courage I'd lacked. I'm sorry, Elena. I'm so sorry." I sat with that apology, turned it over in my mind, examined it for sincerity, and the strange thing was, I believed her. She meant it, this elegant woman, who'd spent her life performing perfection, and had finally cracked under the weight of it. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said honestly. "Not yet, maybe not ever. You hurt me for years, made me feel worthless and unwanted. That doesn't just go away, because you finally understand why you did it." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to understand that it was never really about you. It was always about my own failures, my own regrets. You deserved so much better than what I gave you." We parted awkwardly with no promises of future lunches or reconciliation, but something had shifted, some small recognition that we were both just people, flawed and complicated, and trying to make sense of the damage we'd inherited and the damage we'd caused. In May, the company hit a major milestone. We'd secured a contract with a European manufacturer that explicitly chose us because of our ethical standards and safety record. The profit margins weren't as high as some of our competitors would have demanded, but the contract was long-term, stable, exactly the kind of partnership my grandfather had built the company on. James had opposed it, naturally, arguing we were leaving money on the table, but the board had backed me, and even Linda, who'd been skeptical of my changes, admitted that the company's reputation had improved significantly under my leadership. We celebrated at a company dinner. All the senior staff and board members gathered at a restaurant overlooking Boston Harbor. David Foster pulled me aside during cocktail hour. "Your grandfather would be incredibly proud," he said. "You've done more than just maintain what he built. You've actually made it better." "I've had a lot of help," I said. "You've had help because you were smart enough to ask for it, and humble enough to listen. That's rare, Elena. Treasure it." As the evening wound down, I found myself standing on the restaurant's terrace, looking out at the harbor, where ships moved slowly through the darkness, their lights reflecting on the water. This was my world now, these vessels, and the people who crewed them, the contracts and relationships, and endless decisions that kept everything moving. But it wasn't my whole world. That was the thing I'd learned over the past year. I was Elena Frost, CEO of a shipping company, but I was also Elena Blake, artist and teacher, and person who'd built a life on her own terms. I didn't have to choose between those identities. I could be both, could let each one inform and strengthen the other. The next week, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I announced that I was donating a significant portion of my personal inheritance to establish an arts education fund. It would provide grants to young artists from underprivileged backgrounds, covering not just tuition, but living expenses, supplies, everything they needed to pursue their creative dreams, without the financial terror I'd watched so many talented people struggle with. The fund would be called the William Frost Fellowship for Emerging Artists. My grandfather had never been particularly interested in art, but he'd supported my interest in it because he'd understood that passion mattered, that following what called to you was worth more than following what was expected. Cassandra was the first to call when the announcement went public. "That's beautiful," she said. "Grandpa would love it." "I hope so," I said. "I keep thinking about all the people who have talent, but no opportunity, who get told their dreams aren't practical or profitable or appropriate. If I can help even a few of them avoid that, maybe all of this will have been worth something beyond just money." "You're changing things," she said quietly. "Not just the company, but the whole idea of what it means to be a Frost. That matters more than you probably realize." By summer, the studio had become my sanctuary. I spent hours there, when I wasn't working, painting pieces that would never be sold or displayed, that existed just for the joy of creating them. Some were abstract, explosions of color and emotion. Others were more representational, attempts to capture specific moments or feelings, the way morning light hit the ocean, the shape of storm clouds gathering over the estate. Iris visited in July, her first trip to Newport since I'd inherited everything. I picked her up at the train station, and she stood on the platform, looking around with wide eyes. "This is really your life now," she said, taking in the historic architecture, the obvious wealth. "Parts of it," I said. "Come on. I want to show you something." I drove her to the manor, but instead of going inside, I took her straight to the studio. She stood in the doorway, exactly as Cassandra had, taking it all in, then walked slowly around the space, studying each painting. "Elena," she said finally, "these are incredible. Why aren't you showing these?" "Because they're mine," I said. "Not for sale, not for display, just for me." I spent so long creating art for other people, for therapy patients, or for grades or to prove I was legitimate. These are just for the joy of it. There's power in that, she said, in keeping something sacred, something that's not for consumption or evaluation. But there's also power in sharing, not selling, not performing, just letting people see what you're capable of when you create from that pure place. Her words planted a seed that grew over the following weeks. What if I did share this work, not for profit but for connection? What if the fellowship fund included a gallery component, a place where emerging artists could show their work alongside established artists like I was apparently becoming? I brought the idea to the fellowship board I'd assembled, a group of artists and educators who understood both the creative world and the practical challenges young artists faced. They loved it, immediately started planning how it could work, what space we'd need, how to structure shows that would give emerging artists real exposure without exploiting them. By September, we'd secured a building in Boston's Arts District, a former warehouse, with good bones and incredible light. The renovation would take months, but the vision was clear. The William Frost Gallery and Arts Center, a space dedicated to supporting and showcasing artists who might otherwise never get the chance. I'd donate some of my own work for the inaugural show, not the pieces from my studio, but new work, paintings that explored what it meant to inherit legacy and build identity, to stand between past and future and forge your own path. The day we broke ground on the renovation, my father showed up. I hadn't invited him, hadn't even told him about the project, but there he was, standing awkwardly at the edge of the construction site. "Cassandra told me about this," he said when I walked over. "I wanted to see it." We stood together, watching the construction crew begin their work, the sound of machinery loud in the morning air. "Your grandfather started the company, in a building not much different from this," my father said after a while. "A warehouse by the docks, nothing fancy, just space and possibility." He used to tell me that empires were built in unglamorous places, by people willing to do unglamorous work. "I remember you telling me that once," I said, "when I was a kid, before everything got so complicated between us. I told you a lot of things I didn't really believe anymore," he said quietly. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to build something for reasons beyond profit. Watching you do this, it reminds me of who I used to be, or who I wanted to be." "It's not too late to remember," I said. He looked at me, and I saw something in his face I'd rarely seen before, hope maybe, or possibility. "Maybe not," he said, "maybe not." The gallery opened in December, just in time for the holidays. The inaugural show featured work from the first 3 fellowship recipients, alongside pieces from myself and several established artists who donated work to support the cause. The opening night was packed, people spilling out of the gallery space into the December cold, everyone wanting to see this new venture, from the woman who'd unexpectedly inherited a shipping empire and apparently had other talents as well. I stood in the corner, watching people move through the space, studying the paintings, reading the artist's statements. One of my pieces hung on the far wall, a large canvas that showed a figure standing on a cliff edge, looking out at a vast ocean. The figure's face wasn't visible, their posture suggested both uncertainty and determination, someone poised between staying and leaping, between safety and possibility. I'd called it inheritance. Cassandra found me in my corner, pressed a glass of wine into my hand. "You did it," she said. "You actually did it." "Did what?" I asked. "Built something that matters, changed what it means to be us, to be a Frost. Grandpa gave you money and power, but you turned it into something better, into opportunity for people who needed it, into art and education, and possibility. That's extraordinary." Elena. I looked around the gallery, at the young artists nervously watching people respond to their work, at the established artists who'd come to support them, at the community that was already forming around the space. He believed I could do this, I said. Even when I didn't believe it myself, he saw something in me that I couldn't see, and he bet everything on it. And you proved him right, Cassandra said, not by being perfect, but by being brave enough to try, to fail, to keep trying anyway. That's the real inheritance, Elena. Not the money or the company, but the belief that you could be better than what you were born into. That night, after the gallery cleared out, and the city went quiet, I walked along the waterfront, my coat pulled tight against the December wind. The year had transformed me, in ways I was still trying to understand. I'd gone from being the family embarrassment, the unwanted mistake, to being the CEO of a major company, and the founder of an arts initiative that might actually change lives. But more than that, I'd learned what it meant to stand in my own power, to make choices based on values, rather than fear, to build a life that honored both who I'd been, and who I was becoming. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When I opened it, I found a message and a photo. The message read, "Thank you for believing in me when no one else did." The photo showed a young woman standing in front of one of her paintings at the gallery, her smile so bright it seemed to light up the whole image. It was one of the fellowship recipients, and her gratitude was so genuine, so pure, that I felt tears spring to my eyes. This was what my grandfather had wanted. Not just for me to run a successful company, or maintain the family fortune, but to use whatever I'd been given to make space for others, to lift up people who'd been dismissed or overlooked, to prove that worth wasn't measured in money or status, but in what you did with whatever you had. I'd spent so long feeling like I wasn't enough, like I didn't belong, like I'd failed simply by being myself. But standing there on the waterfront, looking at that photo of a young artist celebrating her first show, I finally understood. I was exactly enough, I belonged exactly here, and being myself wasn't failure, it was the whole point. The company would continue, stronger and more ethical than it had been. The gallery would grow, supporting more artists, creating more opportunities. My family would keep healing or not, each person on their own timeline, making their own choices about who they wanted to become. And I would keep painting, keep leading, keep building the quiet thing my grandfather had always told me to build, the thing that would matter long after everything else faded. I turned away from the water, and headed back toward my car, toward the manor that was finally home, toward whatever came next. The city lights reflected on the harbor, beautiful and temporary, like everything worth having, and I was ready. Ready for the work, ready for the challenges, ready for all of it, because I'd learned the secret my grandfather had known all along. Legacy wasn't what you inherited, it was what you built with what you'd been given, how you transformed pain into purpose, how you turned endings into beginnings. And mine, I knew with absolute certainty, was just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just